Good afternoon, Penhaul, who is going to talk about how to keep an athlete moving. It's an insight into performance management of world record attempts and world-class athletes, team collaboration, and how the multidiscipline approach works when you're keeping these people on the road and keeping them moving forward in their mission and their sort of world record attempts.
Thank you very much, Mark. Welcome, everybody. And sorry, this is slightly off the cuff and be different to kind of obviously what you're expecting, but hopefully there's a few takeaways from it. So to give you guys a little bit of background from me, of those of you that don't know me, I am slightly different in the world of healthcare profession. So my background started out as a physiotherapist. And over the sort of last 16 years, I guess, I've done 4 Paralympic and Olympic cycles. It's taken me through Vancouver, London and Rio Games. And obviously I was in full preparation and swing for Tokyo 2020, which has obviously now been postponed thanks to the COVID malarkey. But yeah, so I've come from a world of performance, and in performance we are constantly on the front edge of really trying to push boundaries of performance and trying to eke out how can we best optimize, whether it's physiology, whether it's the psychology, whether it's kind of, from my point of view, physical preparation, prevention over cure. So we are constantly trying to seek and see what we can get out of individuals to really push abilities. And that was never more at the forefront than when I worked with Paralympic athletes, which is partly why I loved it. It was always about trying to find people's abilities rather than their disabilities, and really working around that, loads of problem solving, which obviously I thoroughly enjoy. And for me, working in Paralympic sport, it really opened my eyes to kind of the sort of the interlink as well between psychology and physiology. And it always made me kind of question, we're really fortunate with actually being healthy and fully fit. So what do we actually draw on when we're faced with wanting to give up? And when we're wanting to give up, it makes us sort of thankful to be sort of alive and thankful to sort of then want to really push ourselves further forwards. And then it mentioned kind of, well, why do we wait for adversity to be thrown at us in order to sort of see what we're capable of? And that's what drew me to wanting to then row across the Pacific Ocean to really test myself. But more importantly, I wanted to get closer and build that rapport with my Paralympic athletes that I was working with at the time, to understand what mental challenges and what they face with when they were wanting to give up at times. And, you know, fundamentally with doing the Pacific Row as an expedition for myself, actually, you know, I was there by choice. So we never know how we're going to respond when we're not having the opportunity to have choice. And it's something that's a curveball and it's thrown in our pathway. So working with the Paralympic squad taught me a huge amount, much more on the holistic front than it was the specifics. And in the world of sport, you know, I'm surrounded by people that are really excellent at what they do. We fully go into the fact of, you know, if we're going to load a tendon, why are we loading it, how are we loading it, how do we get tenocyte change, how do we create interstitial fluid change, what's the loading we need to do to get the right response. And so we question every single thing that we're doing and the input that we give to an athlete to make sure that we're maximizing their energies, that we're trying to get the best out of them. And that's kind of what we're driving constantly all the time. Make sure the foundations are right and the foundations are in place in order to get the best out of them, and then start to do the marginal gains on top of that. Now, after I worked with Paralympics, I then went into supporting. I left after Rio, came out of the sort of, you know, the sport bubble after having then done the expedition around across the Pacific. And then I went and supported Naomi Osaka, who's world #1 tennis player, and putting the performance management plan around her. So again, trying to get the best out of her. This was when she was top 40, so the year before she came world #1, and it was all about sort of seeing where the major gains are going to be. Was it nutrition that we needed to sort? Was it sort of her warm-up? Was it her strength and conditioning? Was it psychology? Was it on-court, off-court psychology? What was the thing that needed to be our biggest foundational gain? And then it was about pulling the right people in, the right expertise to get the best out of her. And alongside sort of having worked with Naomi, I then collaborated or joined forces with sort of bringing my performance into the expedition world when I supported the likes of Mark Beaumont in his Around the World in Under 80 Days. As you know, with Mark Beaumont, some of you that were online yesterday, we talked a lot about our collaboration and having currently writing our book, The Endurance, and the podcast that's currently out, in order to sort of again highlight the underpinning of the science, the expertise, the research that's currently out there, making sure the right voices are heard. After the back of that, I've just obviously going into Tokyo. We've been with the British sailing team as their lead physio for the past sort of 2.5, 3 years. And with these guys, it's a sport that I didn't know anything about. Not really, not to the elite performance point of view. And it's a sport that's got 10 classes, and everything has got, each class has got completely different physical demands. So it's been a really good insight into sort of, the different demands on the class, on the body. And also alongside that, from our point of view, it's so important to ask ourselves, like, how do we keep this athlete moving? And a big thing that I've kind of changed the whole strategy approach in our physio space was about how do we maximize availability? How do we sort of come into maximizing keeping that athlete sailing, keeping that athlete doing the sport that they love, whilst also making sure that we approach and minimize injury, and also make sure we get over an injury as quickly as possible to maximize their availability. And so therefore, strategic direction has taken more of what I call a seatbelt approach rather than a stop sign approach. And in sport, we can often, and especially as medics, or the medical field, we tend to automatically go into, oh God, you're injured, right, stop, can't continue to sail, we need to sort this out. Whereas in sailing, we've really tried to adapt that and sort of make sure that we can keep somebody moving and keep them sailing, which was a crucial thing and a change. So often you might see a sailor that has actually had a fractured ankle and they're in a boot, and yet they've still been able to stay on the water and keep their sort of decision making, cognitive ability and feel going on sailing, whilst we sort of try and help them to optimize their healing through use of a number of different things. That's a real whistle-stop tour to kind of give you that brief overview. But the kind of everything from my experience of that sort of history has led me to kind of how I then support athletes on the road. And the biggest thing, I guess, from my point of view, for those that you're watching, are going to be of a range of medical backgrounds, whether that's from medics to nurses to paramedics. And I guess, I've taken an ethos of where I've come from physio, and a lot of you may not have seen the role of physio. It's very different in sport. We tend to be the ones that really front manage, and then we only pull the doc in. We often are the ones that are traveling away with athletes independently. We never have a doc with us, and so we're always sort of asking the doc on a remote sort of service. So therefore we end up having to deliver and do trauma care ourselves with remote access to docs or medics in ourselves. So, even from a point of view of medical conditions that I've had to deal with on flights and all sorts with the Paralympic squad. That being said, I kind of keep my trauma stuff up to date as best I can. It's nowhere near to obviously the extent of you guys that are ED doctors or kind of those of you that are on that front line from a paramedic point of view. But I keep my hand in sort of volunteering with the RNLI, doing CAS care there. And when we're in sport, we do what's called ICIS, so immediate sort of frontline critical care. And with that stuff in sport, that's all based on the sort of RFU guidelines. And it does sort of teach us to do kind of a needle decompression if we had to, or crike, those sorts of bits. But I mean, I would never go into that space because I know that that's not my boundary of expertise. Well, that is my boundary. I certainly wouldn't go there unless I really, really had to, because I'm not experienced in it and I'm not doing it. However, I know that if I was there and there was a doctor that was doing it, that I would be able to be a support and to get the right kit in place and support that process. So that kind of leads me to sort of going into the space of how important it is to push the boundaries of performance, but to do it in a safe boundary way. And when I mean by that is kind of in expeditions, you've got to know what those boundaries of safe working are. As a physio, we've most probably got a few more boundaries than most. But then saying that kind of, that goes to any of us. Like, so I've been from an RNLI point of view, having to treat and deal with somebody that's in respiratory arrest or going into cardiac arrest as well then subsequently, and a flood of like doctors coming over to say, I'm a doctor, let me jump in. And actually, it turns out that they're not a sort of an A&E doctor, or they're not sort of an anaesthetist that's good with airways. So therefore, actually, it's better to kind of maintain that leadership and utilize the skill set best way possible. So understanding what your boundaries are is crucial. You know, if you're a gynecologist and you're faced with a trauma situation and you've not dealt with that for a number of years, then but somebody next to you has, then it's just understanding who's going to be best to deal with the situation. Alongside that, I would say kind of first and foremost, whoever you are, it's about looking after yourself in expeditions or whenever you travel away with teams. It's always the thing that we forget about. And it's only been the last sort of couple of years have I really sort of tried to put this forward and centre. The amount of times I've done stuff and stuck myself in an absolute hole, and I'm only sleeping for sort of 2-3 hours in order to make sure that the athlete or the person that's doing the expedition is really looked after, is the main thing. But as we know, as we spoke about yesterday, sleep management is crucial. Looking after yourself is absolutely fundamental, because if you don't, then it actually your care is going to suffer. So, you know, your decision making and all of those things are going to be under question. So look after yourself first and foremost, and then you can look after the expedition that's in hand. Alongside that, you know, I always surround myself by experts, and that comes back to my boundaries of safe working. So when I supported Mark, it was the World Extreme Medicine team that were behind me, plus I had other docs, other physiologists and nutritionists, whoever it was, that were at my beck and call. So I might have been the person that was on the road delivering it, but I knew that kind of I felt confident and safe to do so because I had the right expertise behind me. Now, with that is a kind of, you know, I also carried the right kit. So I carried an RDT piece of kit, which meant I could do live assessment when we came across a road traffic accident. I was able to assess. But then, for instance, Sean Hudson was my trauma doc from World Extreme Medicine at the end of the phone. And he also then had a live feed with sort of being able to monitor ECG, anything that sort of I was able to capture, basically blood pressure, and all the normal sort of basic obs of heart rate, respiratory rate, etc. So having the ability to kind of know that you've got a backup of expertise around you is definitely helps to improve your competence and your confidence when you're in a given situation. And that goes the same, I would say, to whether you're a doc or a paramedic. Yes, you can very much deal with kind of when, excuse the pun, but shit hits the fan. You're going to be in your element. You're going to know that without a doubt. However, from my world and kind of from the physio context, the constant analysis is about how we keep people moving. So the lower end of when somebody twists their ankle, when somebody dislocates their shoulder, you know, something that's like that, yeah, it's not great, it's not ideal, but you guys would go to automatic pain medication and splinting and basics. There's a few other bits and pieces that we would consider. And I hope that sort of I can share some of those insights today so you can take those away for your own practice when you're in expedition. The other thing to kind of take from that is that, you know, rather than being sort of, you know, the point of thinking that, or the sort of that performance role is the key role, like actually it's a small percentage. The major thing, and you would have seen this across talks this weekend, is that it's those soft skills, it's those team player, the kind of just getting your hands dirty, getting stuck in, and just making sure that the expedition continues to move forwards is crucial. The chances of stuff going completely like horrendously wrong, you would have heard lots of stories this weekend, but the chances of that actually happening are the smaller percentage. The likelihood is it's the normal day-to-day sort of bog standard stuff that goes on is about 80% of the time. And so therefore, actually, if you were to sit there and be like, well, I'm the medic, I don't want to get involved in that, straight away, you're not necessarily going to be the best person to be on an expedition team. It's all about sort of getting stuck in, whether that's doing the cooking, whether that's doing flipping washing stuff, whether it's having to dig a bloody car out of a muddy pit when it's got stuck and you're getting behind it and pushing it. It doesn't matter. It's all hands on deck, and it 100% is, there is no egos. There is none of that sort of stuff when it comes down to expedition. Everybody's equal, everybody to offer. So drawing on those soft skills is crucial, and also so knowing what your skill set is that you bring to the party. Next to that, I would say very much in my space, it's always about prevention versus cure. And what I do find is kind of when we're asked to maybe do expeditions or come and support an expedition or any sort of event of the kind, you end up just turning up on the day. And if I've been asked to do stuff, I really do highly recommend getting the history before you even go, understanding what the kit and caboodle is that they might be providing, and if it's not adequate enough, making sure you flag it. But the other big thing is if you're going to support somebody climbing Kilimanjaro, for instance, know what their physical state is, know what their preparation is, and know what their kind of history is, because prevention is always better than cure in any of these situations. And you want to minimize your chances of being left with the unknown. So definitely prevention over cure where you can do, driving them to sort of go and see physios or get S&C, strength and conditioning sort of support, going to the gym, prepping themselves the best way possible so that they're in shape, to minimize actually needing to draw on your skills when you really don't want it in sort of the top of Kili, and it all becomes a bit more of a difficult thing to manage. And then finally, I'd say, you need to know your environment. And again, this has been sort of quite a common thing across this weekend, is sort of knowing your environment, and therefore what kit you can take with you that's going to be appropriate, but also knowing what space, what kind of, what's the deal of the environment. Is it hot? Is it cold? What are going to be the issues that you're going to be faced with from illness or injury that that's going to be at risk? What's the terrain that they're going to be going over? What's the ascent? All of that sort of stuff, to know, potentially figure out what your risks are. And then alongside that, it's very much about understanding what the sport, the activity is that you're going to be supporting. So in this one, we've got sort of the guys. Adaptive Grand Slam was the team that I supported, but did it remotely. So it was all about their performance preparation and getting them in the best physical state possible for them to achieve the 7 highest peaks in the world and the 2 poles. And here you've got Jacko, who's a single arm amputee, and he's also got a lot of skin tissue loss down his left leg due to an IED blown up when he was in the military. And Jacko, for instance, it's about, you then have to sort of think about, from our point of view in prevention, I'm looking at what's his circulation, how does his tissues correspond to heat change, and actually the exposure to the cold environment. How are we going to keep his stump warm? How do we prevent ulcers, all of those sorts of things, or pressure sores, should I say. And how do we sort of manage him best and maintain sort of power and strength through that left leg and optimize it as best as possible. Vice versa, like coming into the sailing team, the interesting thing when I first joined these guys was that actually, I was looking at, well, crikey, we haven't got much trauma kit and stuff here. These guys now are on massive foiling boats. They're doing speeds of in excess of 25-30 knots through the water, which is the same as a speedboat, our RNLI sort of D class. It's these are fast boats, and those blades that you see there underneath Ben and sort of just down the front of the hull or the bow, they absolutely slice through the water. And it's been known with these NACRA boats that there's already been significant catastrophic bleeds with a popliteal artery through the back of the knee, a couple of others that have just missed the tibial artery through lower limb slices when somebody's fallen overboard and the boat's carried on and they've caught their legs. So we've had significant injuries in that class. It's a new class. And so therefore, major trauma kit, the coaches that are out on the water and the athletes that are out on the water aren't carrying anything to prepare themselves. And obviously in water, if you've got significant bleed, you're going to bleed out a lot quicker than on dry land. So to me, it was a really obvious thing that we needed to sort that out. So one of my big strategic aims over the last 3 years was to do a new trauma strategy with these guys. And because I'm not there, because the doc's not there with them 24/7, these guys go away training by themselves. They're in different venues all around the world. And it's often just them and the coach. And even when they turn up to an event, the event don't necessarily actually coordinate or sort out proper medical support on the water. Or if they do, they think it's all right to have one medical boat covering a very large area, which would take them still 20 minutes to get across a bay, which to me is not good enough. So therefore, I did an education and trauma pathway for our coaches and athletes, and all to be trained in the same way. We designed new flashcards alongside sort of our RNLI sort of life support system. And we made sure that the coaches and athletes were trained in how to deal with catastrophic bleeds and have a proper top class sort of first aid response certificate. And then we do regular scenario training with them out on the water in their environment from their boats, making sure that they can evac from the water quickly, and just practice with that as regularly as possible. So that was kind of the key thing that we instilled with these guys. And again, it's knowing your environment. So you could be the person supporting one of these events, but actually you're based back on shore. So it's knowing kind of where you're going to be and how close you're going to be to the action, so to speak, to make sure you can deliver the care. And if it's not you, how can you train and make sure the others are upskilled enough to support in the right way possible. When I come back to like environment, so with the likes of Mark Beaumont, we had to really think about what were going to be the injuries and illnesses that were going to be most prevalent for him, and then put a strategy around that. So, he was cycling around the world with the aim with under 80 days, and we were going to be following in a vehicle, as you see there, in a good old camper van. So in this sort of scenario, we had to really think about what's the injuries, what the illnesses he's going to be faced with. And let's face it, number one was always going to be illness going around the world. You just sort of know that he's going to deplete. Like he was cycling 240 miles a day every day for sort of under 80 days. So without a doubt, he's in depletion always. And it was how to maximize that the best. That does come down to what I was delivering him with recovery, but it is also about how do we boost his immunity beforehand. Gut resilience is something that was crucial. We're going around the world, food sources were going to be variable. So how could we maximize his immunity? And that came from 6 months out. Building his gut microbiome through diet, through supplements, also doing sort of gut tolerance type stuff of getting his stomach to be stressed and adaptable to different foods and different volumes of food and different types of foods, even when he didn't want it. And really trying to build that resilience. Same with kind of from the point of view of illness, like I had to have an illness strategy and plan around the team. So we had this follow vehicle plus another one that would be the support vehicle. But if anybody had any illness, so sign of, a cold or any of that sort of stuff, they were out of that vehicle and had to stay in the other vehicle or actually be removed from being on the road, which was crucial because I just didn't want him exposed to any germs. And obviously we tried to keep that van clear as much as possible. It's cleaned down like 5 times a day. And this was in that van, it was just Mark and it was myself. So every strategy around how do we maximize his immunity and how do we minimize or prevent illness sort of entering his environment as best possible, really. The other thing from that was skin health, like, saddle sores, that sort of thing, pressure sores. How do we maximize or minimize the risk of that? So different saddles, the trial, the pressure mapping before we went. Also sort of the clothing. He was sponsored by a clothing company, and therefore I spent a lot of time with them about sort of research and development, making sure there weren't any seams that were going to cause pressure sores because of the repetitive nature of cycling, and really sort of thinking through as much as possible all the problem solving things, again, to prevent rather than cure at the time. Alongside that, kind of, he's in that position, and we know that with Ride Across America, which we'll be doing actually next year with a couple of people from GCN as well as Mark, overuse fatigue in the neck is extremely prevalent, especially with Ride Across America athletes. We've seen that they literally lose their head control and they end up having to get their head strapped to a bloody board in order to try and finish the race. So with Mark, this was particularly important to make sure that we he did a load of conditioning through his back, through his trunk, through his neck, which he's never done before, in order to minimize that. And then it was also around treatment and recovery whilst we're on the road to maximize the opportunity and minimize the risk. Overload injuries, we had Achilles peritendinitis, which was going to be common with the big step change in load. That's a high common sort of theme. So, yes, we prepared as best possible to minimize that step change in loading. But going into 240 miles a day, every day for 80 days is always going to be a massive leap. And, he was supposed to do a load of Achilles training and stuff before we went. And what I mean by that is putting sort of, up to 3 times his weight through his Achilles in a loading program 4 times a week, because we know physiologically and sort of mechanically how we can really change tenocytic activity and loading paradigms adequately if we sort of overload. But you've got to overload in a very structured and planned way that's systematic. and unfortunately he wasn't able to complete that. So yeah, we did get some tendon issues with him, and thankfully we were able to manage it as we went. But again, it was prevention was the aim of it. Alongside that, yes, crash traumatic injuries were what we had to plan for, making sure we had, if he had a crash, double femoral fractures could be a risk on a bike, and all sorts of other things. So we had all those strategies in place, understanding each role within the team, who was going to be a communicator, who was going to sort of allocate and sort the road out, who was going to be the person or people looking after Mark, where was our kit stored, all of those processes that you guys all know very well. But that was certainly written out. It was walk through, talk through, and then practiced in real time a few times, and continue to be practiced on the road as well. And then finally, I'd sort of say is the last couple of slides, but going into sort of, when we talk about knowing your environment, it's also about, what's the space, what's the availability that you've got, but kind of in conjunction with that, when you're going on expedition, knowing what you can travel with, knowing what you can go around the world with. As most of you will know, there's only certain medication controlled drugs. Getting them across borders is an absolute nightmare. So what can you take in replacement? So that's where I love Penthrox and stuff. I think it's brilliant, and it's an easy drug to use for pain relief, and it means you can get it across boundaries easily, rather than taking sort of things like fentanyl and stuff. So important to know that as well. Outside of that, the big thing I would sort of encourage from a physio perspective, I suppose, is in what's our acute management sort of choice. And in this sort of state, I see a lot that people want to give out medications as a bit. That's the sort of first thing to consider. But actually, in ultra endurance, I mentioned this yesterday, and I've written a chapter about this, or a section about this in the book, endurance book. Ultra endurance, we do not give anti-inflammatories, ibuprofen and those sorts of things, because of the risk on the kidneys. And there's now more and more research that's coming out to show significant poor kidney failure, or kidney damage as well, up to a week after doing an ultra event, where people have preloaded or during event have taken ibuprofen or similar anti-inflammatory medications. So the way I would manage anything that looks like it's acutely inflamed will be more Voltarol patches, which I know we have in the UK. I found it's quite difficult to get hold of similar things in different countries. France, Spain do have them, but like it's patches basically, whether it contains diclofenac or Voltarol, that type of base. Otherwise, usual ice management can compress splinting, and then we do have other things like Compex and stuff, which is like a muscle stim, which can also help to alleviate and help sort of get the circulation to get a good muscle pump, to also add as a bit of a pain relief. And those are sort of the whistle stop tours. Now, from a physio point of view as well, what kit do I want to take if there's a bit of a trauma? I keep it really simple. Splints, whether it's slings, SAMs or Kendricks, which I'm sure most of you on this call are very familiar with. But it's just making sure you do train yourself and get yourself familiar with actually how to apply it. The amount of times I've done some training with docs and asked them to put on a sling, and they've, you forget how to do it. Like it's we do forget because you don't do it all the time. So it is just worth making sure you're familiar, and especially with things like the Kendrick, uber easy to use, but worth just making sure you're familiar with how you would apply it. From my point of view, the easy sort of a physio that you could get to teach some basic taping, like having a couple rolls of tape, you can use it in a number of different ways. You could use it to tape up other stuff anyway. But if somebody's twisted their ankle, there's nothing better than just sticking some tape around to support it. You're not going to take all belts and braces for sort of other limbs. You can't carry a knee support or shoulder support, ankle support, but a roll of tape you can do, which is enough to at least give them some pain relief and some support, so that they can continue to move and get down off a mountain. So whether you're using different types of tape, you'll see things like K-tape, rock tape, that sort of stuff. That's fine for a bit of facilitation, but really what you want is the stiff stuff. That sort of flesh coloured Leukotape P is a good combi. And if somebody is nice and swollen, then just getting some compression Coban non-adhesive or co-adhesive basically is a good thing to have in your bag for compression. And then you can stick some of that Leukotape P over the top to give it some external support if you want. And that is a tour from me to just give you a bit of an insight into kind of actually what sports physio potentially has a background to add to the matrix and might be good to have as a contact for you if you're going on expedition and stuff. If you're a doc, a pharmacy, oh, you could be a pharmacist as well, but a paramedic or nurse, it's worth sort of having some other sort of disciplines in your back pocket to give you some support.
Thank you for stepping in at the last moment and doing a brilliant talk.
No.
I've got a few questions for you. I've got one from Pris, where she asked, are there any top tips for getting involved with the Paralympics? And also, with the different types of trips that you do and events, how much does your kit vary?
Yeah, no, good question. I mean, getting into Paralympic sport, I mean, fundamentally, it's about getting into sport as a whole. If you're a physio, it's good to maybe have a look into what's a website we're now getting involved in is actually creating a network of mentoring. So HD-PN is worth typing into Google. I'll put it on the chat afterwards. But basically, it's a high net sort of group of us, so the likes of James Moore and other people that have worked in Team GB and are kind of key consultants for diagnostics and whatnot, key specialists. We've now created this sort of network of people to do mentoring and online resourcing and online sort of sessions. So yeah, that's all started kicking off recently, and you become a member. It's really getting into sport is easy. So it is a case of what you can do once you've graduated, the courses that you do, but then it's just about also exposing yourself to supporting sporting context. So Paralympic in specific, then yeah, for sure, if you've got an opportunity to go and observe and help out at places like Stoke Mandeville. I mean, I did a 6-month placement with them, which was brilliant. So then really got exposure with spinal cord injuries. I also did I used to volunteer with the Backup Trust as a charity organisation. That's a brilliant organisation. You can then go away and I've sort of helped to facilitate on a scuba diving course. So I got to scuba dive myself whilst I was then a buddy with somebody that was, had a spinal cord injury. So there's loads of charities like that are absolutely brilliant. Friends of mine now run Accessible Adventures, which again is for people with different disabilities to get them jet skiing, water skiing, all sorts of things like that, taking them skiing abroad. So, and there's a number of military charities as well that are also looking for volunteers. So getting yourself involved with some of the volunteering environments, which means you can go along and support, is one good way. But also to get into actually elite sport, which is like the Paralympic sport context, then having a look at the English Institute of Sport. They've got a great access, great pathway. They run a company they called ESPA. They run courses, and ESPA, it gives you modules to do that leads you to an MSc as well, and that starts to give you exposure to elite sport management, and then when you're in that sort of ring, you can then start to work your way through what's called the ACPSM, so Associated Chartered Physios in Sports Medicine. And with that, you've got a different tiering: bronze, silver, gold, and they have different prerequisites of kind of your experience. So there's a few places, but have a look at HD-PN, and I'll put that on the website later. And certainly we're there to mentor and sort of help support people into getting into sport, basically.
And Laura,
you said,
partially...
Sorry, Mark, I just realised I only answered half your question. I was on a rattle, wasn't I? You did ask me about kit as well. Kit totally varies. It depends on who you're supporting. So Paralympic wise, I mean, for instance, with that, I would end up carrying sort of stronger medications that the docs would prescribe and give me authorization to provide if I needed it. So, for instance, with spinal cord injuries, I'd be carrying nifedipine in case of autonomic dysreflexic responses. And obviously alongside that, I made sure that we carried sort of blood pressure cuff and other sort of tools and techniques to observe. So catheters and whatnot are often something that causes AD in spinal cord injury. So what kit you take depends on your context of the environment that you're in, but obviously the people that you're looking after, and thinking about how remote you're going to be and how close to access and support you're going to be as well.
Thank you for answering both those questions.
Very
Jesse had a question, and actually, I've known you for quite a long time now, and I'm not sure that I know the answer to this question. It's about how you
Mm.
personally became involved in expeditions and as a physio on expeditions, in terms of
Mm.
signposting how somebody else might follow that same route.
Yeah, no, it is a good question. I suppose it's like most people that we've spoken to over this weekend, where whether you're a doc, whether you're a paramedic, your physio, often it starts with the fact of having a personal interest in expeditions or kind of doing outdoors activities. So for me, I've always done that on a personal front. The biggest sort of door opener was the fact that I did the Road to Pacific. So for me, putting that team together and then reaching out and sort of then finding and sort of collaborating with you, Mark, at that sort of point in time, I suppose was quite crucial. And then that's just evolved because having done that, having sort of my sports experience, Mark Beaumont, for instance, contacted me because I'd met him during sort of the doing the row, because I'd really reached out to far and wide to get some experience and get some knowledge from others that had rowed. And then Mark had contacted me just after I finished the games, and he was like, basically, with my sports experience plus having done the row, knowing that I could cope with sleep depot and sort of pushing myself, then he felt like that would be a good fit to sort of support him on the around the world in 80 days. So, and certainly looking after one athlete versus 80 odd athletes is definitely a little bit more manageable. But then I'm quite glad of that when I'm sleep deprived in 80 days. So yeah, so different ways, but yeah.
And how you mentioned the RNLI being on the lifeboat crew, is the fact you're a physio, is that important in your role in the crew, or is it an additional skill, or did they take you on because you were a physio?
Yeah, no, it's a good point. No, the lifeboat, I think it was, we don't have a huge amount of medical. We've got one other doc that is on the crew. I mean, often there are a couple of docs that are usually on lifeboat crews. And given sort of Ed's the only sort of medical that's on the crew now, I think that added to the fact that sort of I had a different exposure, but had a bit more medical experience than most that are on the crew. And alongside that, it's I guess it does bring about sort of how do we prepare ourselves to be on the D class. In St Agnes, where I'm based, our lifeboat launch is a little bit tricky compared to others. A lot of lifeboats, it can be out of channel, it can be quite comfortable. We're straight into surf, so it's quite physically demanding, and it's the only one in the country that we go straight into breaking surf. So with that in mind, actually looking after the crew has been seems to be a bit more of an evolving role that I play, rather than actually the lifeboat sort of piece. But yeah, and I think it was just good timing as well that I just happened to rock up at a time when they were looking for more crew, which was a bonus.
I think it highlights the multiplicity of different directions that you can take with your medical training, be it paramedics, nurses, physios, doctors. There are so many things you can do. And actually, what's probably more important is to follow your passion rather than intellectualize it too much. Because in the environment that we work in, you have to love what you're doing, because otherwise you're not going to get or put up with being cold and wet and damp. There has to be a passion. And I think that's a crucial bit of advice for anybody sort of looking at this and wanting to take it forward. You don't do what you think you should do, or people are telling you, or what's glamorous even. Do what you really love.
Yeah, and I could not echo that anymore, Mark, to be honest. There's been a couple of talks. Stephen Fabes, we talked about it yesterday, about, he was sort of saying, he went away, did 6 years in traveling the world and exploring sort of the medical delivery in different countries and stuff. And I was, I said the same to him. You could see that he was like, oh, maybe I should get back on the ladder. And I was like, there's no should about it. If you want to, then do it. If you don't, you should never be in a place that it's kind of forced by societal norms or what expectations other people have. You got to follow your heart, follow your passion, follow your purpose. And I think that sometimes can be lost. We get onto a bit of a rat race of kind of, what we should learn, what we should keep climbing to. And that's fine if that's what you want to do to get you to a place. But actually, like you say, portfolio, careers, non-linear sort of direction of things. If it's what you enjoy, it's when, that's what WEM has given for me, to be honest, Mark. Like I've got to the point in sport after 16 years that it's not giving me the buzz anymore. And I remember Matt, my partner, sort of, he came up to Scotland last year, well, maybe a couple of years ago. And he actually reflected back to me whenever I come back from the conference. He's like, you just absolutely sparkle. You just come alive because you're surrounded by people that are just so humble and so like open and sharing, and you just feed off. And that to me, like, I absolutely love, like, that's what this conference is all about. It's just brilliant to sort of see there's no egos, there's just sharing of knowledge, support from everybody in every sort of aspect. And that's what you've grown, Mark, which is phenomenal.
Thank you very much. I think it's the intangible, isn't it? When you work with teams who love what they do and they know that they're doing something good and positive, there is an energy that you don't often get in everyday life. And we talk about this quite often, that when faculty and stuff get together, you're recharging your battery because you're with kindred spirits. And I think maybe that's another sort of tenet, isn't it? Travel with kindred spirits and follow your passion. I mean, it's leading quite nicely into Nick's sort of closing session tonight, sort of Taoism and extreme medicine. But I mean, you've inspired me in terms of looking at you and how you develop the way that you're going, and it's about passion, and it's about interest and fulfilling yourself and not fulfilling somebody else's version of who they want you to be.
Exactly, couldn't agree more. Exactly that, Mark.
On that note, I think we've come to an end. Thank you for the questions in the chat. Some great questions there. Apologies for the change of session, but what an amazing session from Laura, regardless. So thank you, Laura, for stepping in at the last moment. And I look forward to seeing you later in the event. Thank you very much, guys. Bye-bye.
Thanks all. Ciao.